In the eerie silence of the dimly lit city morgue, the corpse of a dead man lay draped with a freshly laundered sheet. There was no external evidence of foul play, but the state medical examiner ordered an autopsy, which resulted in a verdict of murder. On physical and medical evidence supplied by the medical examiner, the murderer was caught and convicted. This is an example of the skill of medical men who have entered the profession of forensic medicine, a new profession of men who work with law enforcement agencies, men who are sometimes called courtroom doctors. The Johns Hopkins Science Review, presented by Johns Hopkins and WAAM in Baltimore, in cooperation with the DuMont Television Network. This is Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, famed for 78 years for its contribution to science and the humanities. Here in its many hospital and university laboratories, Hopkins scientists are constantly probing into the secrets of science, which, when discovered, will be translated into benefits to be enjoyed by you. Each week, we look over the shoulders of today's scientists and catch a glimpse of the results of their research. Now watch the work of courtroom doctors. Here to introduce this week's program from Johns Hopkins University is Lynn.
Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another Johns Hopkins Science Review. You know, over the past weeks and the months and the years, we've been discussing how science affects each one of us. And we realize that scientific developments are used in many facets of our own work and our own lives. Now, one place that science is being used is in crime detection. This is a vast field and a growing field because police laboratories all over the country are using more and more scientific instruments in the detection of crime. Now, we can't discuss all of those this week, but I would like to point out just a few of them to you. I'd like you to see this shirt. Now, if you looked at this shirt, you would see nothing unusual about it. But if you were to take this ultraviolet light and play it on this shirt in the dark, you would find right along here some laundry marks. Now, the science of light is used in many ways in crime laboratories because you can track down criminals with it. Let me show you this screwdriver, for instance. This screwdriver was used in a burglary. It was used to pry open a metal lock. Now, when it was found on the suspect, chips of paint were found along the edge of the screwdriver. This was tested in a spectrograph, along with paint that was found on the broken metal lock. They matched, and they matched well, and it tied the suspect with the crime. Eventually, the suspect was convicted of this crime. And let's take these two pieces of glass here. If we were to look at them carefully, well, we'd think they didn't fit. But under 3D, a 3D photograph, we'd see that they fit right at this joint. Now, this glass was also tested with a spectrograph because the scientists in crime laboratories don't depend on just one test. They use many tests. The spectrograph showed that these two pieces of glass were the same. And then small chips of these were subjected to a test known as density gradient, a principle that is old as the Greeks in science. And it also showed that this piece of glass was the same as this piece of glass, and with many tests, tied the two together and tied a suspect to a crime. Now, one of the newer methods in crime detection is known as forensic medicine, where the medical scientist uses his skill in determining evidence at a scene of crime. And we'd like to demonstrate some of these things for you this week, and we have as our guest the staff of the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner of the state of Maryland. All of these men are forensic science specialists, and they can describe some of these things and demonstrate them for us. Now, the first thing that they have to do is identify the body at the scene of a crime. Then they have to find out whether or not the death was caused by natural causes or whether homicide is there. Now, we'd like to ask Dr. Paul F. Guerin to describe how this work is done and perhaps give us an example of a specific case. Dr. Guerin.
Good evening. These are the ashes of a burned shack. The fire began at 11 o'clock in the evening, and several hours after the fire died out, a body was found. This is a picture of the body. The features are not identifiable, and parts of the arms and legs are burned off. A closer look at the skull of this body shows fractures. These are the typical type of fractures that are seen as a result of fire. It's important to differentiate between these fractures and fractures which are the result of a blow. This body was sent to the medical examiner's office for an autopsy. While the autopsy was being performed, valuable information was obtained by investigators. We learned that a white man lived in this house, that he was 60 years of age, that he had brown hair. We learned that he had broken a leg about 6 months prior to this accident. He had last been seen alive at 6 o'clock in the evening, just a few hours before this fire occurred. The autopsy showed no signs of violence. By examination of the skull, it was possible to ascertain that this man was approximately 60 years of age. Enough soft tissues remained to tell that he was a white man, that his hair was brown, and also to establish the sex. An X-ray was taken of a leg of this individual, and it showed a fracture. I have an X-ray here to show the fracture that this gentleman had at the time he was in the hospital with his broken leg. This is the fracture line, and there is a pin in the center of the bone which holds the fragments of bone together while healing occurred. I have a second X-ray here which demonstrates the fracture which was examined in the morgue. You'll notice that the fracture is in exactly the same place. It was therefore felt that a definite identification of this man had been made. Chemical studies on his blood showed that there was a high level of alcohol and also that there was a high level of carbon monoxide. We therefore felt that the man was intoxicated at the time of death and that he was alive while the fire was burning. The body was therefore identified, and there was no crime suspected. I have several bones here, or parts of skeletons, to show some of the principles that are used in these cases. The age of an individual can be determined by examining the skull, and particularly the suture lines. This is a suture line, the line where the bones of the skull come together. In young individuals, these lines are plainly visible, but in older individuals, there is bony union, and these lines are no longer visible. This change occurs at approximately 35 years of age. It is also possible, by examining the skull, to tell the sex of an individual. This is the skull of a female, and this a male. Notice that the nasal angle is wider in the female, and that the orbits have a tendency to be rounder, whereas in the male they are somewhat rectangular. Sex can also be determined by examining the pelvis. Here I have a female pelvis and this one a male pelvis. We can see that the angle is more acute in the male pelvis and that the sciatic notch, this notch at this point, is narrower also than in the female. The pelvic outlet is smaller in the male. I cannot stick my fist through the outlet of this male pelvis, but I can very easily do so in the female pelvis. The height of an individual can be determined by measuring a long bone. This is a femur, and by measuring the length of it, it is possible to determine the height of the skeleton. Therefore, by these means, it's possible to identify a body and to arrive at a cause of death and to rule out the possibility of a crime.
As you can see, the medical forensic scientist uses his knowledge of human anatomy, of our own bodies, to determine who the person is, what his race, whether it be male or female, and many other facts about him. Now, this is very important to get the identification and then to find out the cause of death. But every good laboratory has a chemist. The chemist studies the body, finds out a great many things to find out whether a homicide is involved. And we'd like to discuss this for a moment, and we have with us Dr. Henry Frymouth, who can tell us the work of the chemist.
As Mr. Poole has mentioned, one of the principal functions of the laboratory is to determine whether or not a homicidal poisoning has taken place or whether any type of poisoning has been responsible for the death of an individual. Most people, when considering poisoning, think of all poisonings as being of homicidal nature. This is an impression which has probably been fostered by the writers of popular mystery stories, who usually use poisoning as the means of disposing of their victim. As a matter of fact, most poisonings arise either suicidally or accidentally. Some homicides occur, although they have not been planned, when people commit suicide using a poison. For example, if an individual commits suicide by inhaling carbon monoxide from either automobile exhaust or, as formerly occurred, manufactured gas, the persons who were also present in the same atmosphere might die by inhaling that same gas. However, such a homicide was not a premeditated one and might be considered as an accidental or unplanned homicide. However, deliberate and planned homicides can and do occur, although they do occur infrequently. One such case developed in the early spring of last year, the day before Easter as a matter of fact, when a 13-year-old boy and his 23-year-old girl cousin appeared at one of the local hospitals. They stated that both had eaten pancakes prepared by the boy, and shortly after eating them, both had become rather violently ill. They were admitted to the hospital and treated. The girl, fortunately, was saved, but the boy died. The police went to the home where this incident had occurred and recovered therefrom this box of pancake flour, a can which has some all-purpose kitchen flour in it, and a bowl which has some dried pancake batter in it. All three of these articles were subjected to tests in the laboratory. I would like to show you one such test, which is a simple qualitative test, and some of the powder contained in this box has been placed in this vessel here. To that, we add a little bit of acid, and then add to that mixture of acid and flour a clean copper spiral, which has been made by simply winding some copper coil around a glass rod. That is placed in the flask, in the vessel rather, and subjected to heat, and after a period of time the coil is observed. The time which is required is rather long, and so I have prepared a similar coil prior to going on the air, and here are the results of the test. You can see the coil turn a dark gray or black as compared with the bright copper color of the original wire. That showed the probable presence of arsenic. To confirm that, some of the flour was then taken and the organic matter in it was destroyed with acids. It was then placed in this vessel here along with some metallic zinc, and as a result, arsenic, if present, is converted to a gas called arsine, which passes up through here and finally passes over a piece of treated paper. That paper is then removed, and as you can see, there is a spot which has developed on the paper. That shows the presence of arsenic. The amount of arsenic can be determined by comparing it with standard spots. As you see, this matches the 2 microgram stain which I have here. That is known as the Gutzeit test. All of those things resulted positively on the samples taken from the home. The tissues obtained from the boy at autopsy were also tested, and it was shown definitely that he had sufficient arsenic in his tissues to have caused death. The cause of death having been established, further investigation was made by the police, and they found that there was a male acquaintance of the mother who had threatened her life. He had access to the kitchen. It was further shown that He worked in a plant in which he used arsenic trioxide as a routine thing in his occupation. Here is some of the material that he used. With all of these facts having been established, they were presented in the criminal court in Baltimore at the trial of this man. He was convicted of murder in the first degree. I might mention that it was the first such homicidal poisoning which was tried in the criminal courts in Baltimore in 43 years. That gives you some indication of the incidence of homicidal poisonings in the city.
Dr. Frymuth told us earlier today that the incidence of homicidal poisoning throughout the country is quite low. Unfortunately, the incidence of murder with a gun is very high. Now, how does the medical examiner come into this? Well, this picture right here comes into it. This target is very important because many times people will say, yes, I caused the death, but I was across the room cleaning my gun when this happened. Well, now, is that statement true or is it false? How does the forensic medical specialist find this out? These questions can be answered, and we will turn the questions to the Chief Medical Examiner for the State of Maryland, Dr. Russell H. Fisher.
Thank you. Yes, Lynn, homicidal shooting is the commonest mechanism of homicide. Of course, there are many deaths and many serious injuries from shooting which are the result of accident, and it's our problem to try to differentiate the manner in such a shooting. Fortunately, the nature of the wound made may sometimes help us a great deal in determining whether the story presented by the parties in the shooting is true or whether, in fact, it's homicide or accident. Consider, for example, in shotgun wounds where the nature of shotgun pellets are such that as one goes farther from the target with the muzzle, that is, as the range increases, there is apt to be a wider spread of the pellets and hence a bigger wound. In this diagram are represented two gunshot charges from a shotgun, one in which the pellets haven't spread very widely and another in which there is a very broad spread. Obviously, the size of the wound made by these two would be remarkably different. In any given case, if one has available the gun that actually caused the wound, one may very well be able to determine the range of fire by experiments with the same gun and the same ammunition. Such was the case in the case of the man whom you see here, who was shot in a county near Baltimore. And when the police investigators came to the scene, the assailant said, "Oh, yes, I shot him. I shot him from a distance of about 8 feet. He was charging me, and I shot him in self-defense." When we came to examine the wounds, however, we found that from the nature of his wound, which was a gunshot wound of the chest, and which we see in this diagram, that he had many pellet holes in the skin over his left chest, in the neighborhood of the heart, and in fact, as one measured the diameter of the widest spread of the pellets, it came to about 9 inches. This gave us information about range of fire, because when we went to the gun and fired targets, which you see here, when fired from 12.5 feet, the spread of the pellets was very narrow, about 6 inches. If fired from a larger or greater distance, for example, 24 feet, the spread of the pellets was nearly 16 inches. And when a shot was fired from a distance of 18 feet, we found a pattern in which the spread was about 9 inches, which coincided with that in the dead man. Thus, we were able to prove immediately that the shot was not fired from 8 feet, but rather from 18, and this, along with other information, indicated that, in fact, this was a homicidal shooting in which a man was actually getting in his car to leave the scene when the shot was fired. The turnout of this case was a second-degree murder verdict because the evidence had shown that the man's initial statement was not true. Much the same occurs in pistol and rifle wounding. And to show you the nature of the wound, let's look at 3 phases of a rifle wound. The bullet, as it passes towards the skin, deeply indents and bends the skin. And then as a little fragment breaks away and the bullet goes in, grease and dirt on the surface of the bullet is wiped off on the skin. And we find around the wound soiling and evidence that a shot has in fact been fired. If there's close contact between the end of the gun, the muzzle, and the skin, gases expand beneath the skin and strip it up and are apt to slap it back hard against the end of the muzzle. In this case, there may be marks on the skin which show up as little arcs of abrasion of the skin or little cuts in the skin due to the muzzle itself. This same information is applicable in a recent case where a man was found dead in his bed. His wife said, "Oh, I accidentally shot him. I was putting away a gun that he kept under the pillow, and it went off." When we came to examine the wound, however, we found the typical abrasion saying gunshot wound, and then away from the wound, a mark that said the muzzle was struck here. This was a contact wound. It was obvious, therefore, that this woman had in fact held the gun in close contact with her husband's chest at the time he was killed, and science, through physical evidence left by the gunshot wound, aided in the investigation of the case and in the fact that justice was eventually done.
Well, now, many times in these gunshot wounds, it's necessary to do an autopsy. The autopsy is a word that has been used here several times on this program. And the forensic scientists tell us this, that many times people do not want to have an autopsy performed on a body. Well, why should they? What is the value of an autopsy? These are important questions, particularly in crime detection, as they are in straight medical examination after death. These questions I think we should have answered. So let's turn to Dr. William Levitt to find out why an autopsy should be given.
Mr. Poole, an autopsy is quite a gruesome subject to a lot of people. However, in trying to explain it to you, let me tell you something about our work as medical examiners. It involves the investigation of deaths as a result of violence, homicide, suicide, from obscure causes, and in so investigating them, it's important to know what the medical causes of death are. Therefore, an autopsy is necessary. Cooperating with us, and we with them, are the law enforcement officers who investigate the circumstances around a death. Now, throughout the United States, about 20% of all deaths are investigated by such a team. And the facts that are developed by this investigation are very often quite important to the families and friends of the deceased individuals. For instance, if the deceased has a contagious disease, such facts need to be known so that proper preventive measures can be taken. In the case of accidental death, it may be of great financial benefit to the family. Such a case was one that we had recently in which a family was violently opposed to having an autopsy done. It was the death of a man found in the locker room of a plant in which he was employed about the time that his shift went off duty. In investigating the death, there were no apparent external marks of violence, and talking to the family, he had no previous medical history indicating that he might reasonably be expected to die from natural causes. Consequently, an autopsy was ordered. At the autopsy table, the organs showed no organic cause of death. However, in looking over the outside of the body, we found some small lesions. These are blown up pictures of the skin of the right hand and the ball of the foot. And you can see the small, almost dirt-appearing areas. On section, in the next slide, we see the lesions that are produced, and here we see how the skin is elevated at the wound on the ball of the foot. These are typical lesions as a result of death due to electrocution. Consequently, an investigation was made of the locker room, and we found that there was a defective light switch with a fuse blown in the neighboring fuse box, and consequently his death was as a result of accident. The family were therefore entitled to the full amount of double indemnity insurance that they had been paying for over a number of years. So an autopsy may benefit the family, although when the subject is approached to them, they may think that it is a gruesome affair. Now, an autopsy may develop facts that are important in homicide cases or in suspected homicide cases. Such a case we had recently of a young girl that was found dead in a rooming house here in Baltimore. She was found dead on the floor between the bed and the wall with several bruises on her body. The police apprehended a suspect and were holding him for questioning. At autopsy, we found that these bruises were old. The microscopic sections of the tissue showed that the bruises were 2 to 3 days old, and by microscopic examination, you can see the cellular reaction which occurs as a result of injury, and it correlates with the time from whence the injury occurred. So the bruises were not the cause of death. However, on opening the head, we found that she had died of a ruptured congenital aneurysm. Now, this is a diagram showing the vessels at the base of the brain, and the lower diagram shows the aneurysm. And this is a outpouching of the vessel wall, which ruptures, and the hemorrhage dissects around the base of the brain, very much like an ordinary hemorrhage within the brain. However, this is a death due to natural causes as a result of a ruptured congenital aneurysm, and the suspect was released from custody.
You can see how important the medical scientist is in crime detection. We've only been able to present you with a very few of the facts about this very important work that is going on all over the entire United States. But there's one thing that I would like to point out to you. That is that the forensic medical specialist is a scientist, like all other scientists, who is seeking facts. When they're working in their laboratories or in their autopsies, they are not trying to acquit a suspect or to convict a suspect. They are merely trying to get at the facts. And when they get at the facts and gather all the facts in the manner that you have seen here this evening, they present these facts to the law enforcement authorities. Now, working with the law enforcement authorities, they do a great work, as these authorities do in conjunction with these scientists. And it's a wonderful cooperation that is growing up and becoming stronger all over the United States. And when we think about this, we think we're going to have a better life, because these scientists, working with the police forces, are closing in more and more on the criminal element. And we have a great deal to thank them for, and in the future, we'll have a lot more to thank them for. We hope that you've enjoyed this brief glimpse of forensic science, and we very much hope that you'll be with us next week when the Johns Hopkins Science Review tells us how scientists are working toward heating houses with the sun's rays.
This house is heated in the winter and cooled in the summer by the rays of the sun. The heat from this stove, which is used for cooking, is produced by the rays of the sun. The fresh water used by the men in this boat was secured from the salt sea water around them. How is all this possible? For the answers, watch next week as the Johns Hopkins Science Review presents Heating Houses with Sun's Rays. The Johns Hopkins Science Review is produced by Lynn Poole in association with Robert Fenwick and John Lockwood. It's directed by Kennard Calfee and Herbert B. Cahan. Art direction by Barry Mansfield. Your narrator has been Joel Chaseman. The Johns Hopkins Science Review originates in the studios of WAAM in Baltimore.
This is the DuMont Television Network.